Welcome to our journey back to Victorian Manchester, a city of industry, innovation, and shocking inequality. Today, we explore the harsh realities faced by the working class, the overcrowded slums, grinding poverty, and the widespread culture of drink. Manchester in the Victorian era was a city of extremes, a place where industrial ambition collided with human suffering in ways that would leave a permanent mark on history. The city's skyline was dominated by towering factories, chimneys belching thick black smoke that hung over streets like a permanent shroud, and canals that carried raw materials and finished goods in a constant, relentless flow. The roar of machinery echoed through the narrow streets, mingling with the shouts of laborers and the clatter of horse-drawn carts. From the outside, Manchester appeared to be a city of progress, a beacon of industrial achievement and economic power. It was a city that symbolized the very heart of Britain's industrial revolution, a place where wealth was being created at an unprecedented pace, and opportunities seemed boundless for those who had the means to take advantage of them. Yet beneath the surface of this industrial miracle, a different reality unfolded, one that was hidden behind the smoke, the grandeur of new buildings, and the prosperity of the elite. The rapid growth of industry had drawn thousands of people from the countryside and smaller towns in search of work, a tide of human ambition that the city's infrastructure could never fully accommodate. Workers poured into Manchester, often desperate and unskilled, willing to endure long hours and hazardous conditions in exchange for the promise of steady wages, however meager they might be. Entire families moved to the city, hoping to carve out a better life, but what awaited them was not the prosperity they had envisioned. Instead, they found themselves trapped in overcrowded neighborhoods, in slums that were little more than crammed alleys lined with dilapidated houses, where sanitation was virtually non-existent and disease was a constant companion. The living conditions in these slums were appalling by any standard, even for the 19th century. Rooms that were meant to house one or two people instead held entire families, sometimes 3 generations under one roof. Children slept on the floor alongside parents and grandparents. Cooking and washing took place in the same small space, often with a single fireplace serving multiple purposes. Fresh air was scarce, sunlight was a rarity, and the streets outside were clogged with filth, human and animal waste mixing in a pungent stew that made breathing a challenge. Water was contaminated and unreliable, and the threat of epidemics such as cholera and typhoid hung over every household. The mortality rate was staggering, with infants and children particularly vulnerable, and life expectancy in these neighborhoods often barely reaching the age of 30. Despite the conditions, life in Manchester was not entirely devoid of community or resilience. People formed networks of mutual support, sharing resources, advice, and small comforts wherever they could. Neighbors looked after each other's children when parents were working long hours in factories or mills. Informal economies sprang up within the slums, with street vendors, small workshops, and home-based labor providing opportunities for survival, if not wealth. Yet, these measures were only ever partial solutions to the overwhelming challenges that faced the poor. Hunger was a constant threat, with families forced to subsist on bread, dripping, and whatever cheap food they could find. Malnutrition was common, weakening immune systems and making the already high risk of disease even more deadly. The factories themselves were both a source of livelihood and a symbol of oppression. They employed thousands of men, women, and children, often in conditions that would be considered intolerable today. Long hours, dangerous machinery, poor ventilation, and exposure to toxic substances were daily hazards. Children, some as young as 6 or 7, were put to work, crawling through narrow tunnels or climbing high chimneys, performing tasks that risked life and limb. Injuries were common, and compensation was rare. The industrial system demanded relentless labor while offering little protection or reward, a stark contrast to the prosperity it generated for factory owners and industrialists. The streets of Victorian Manchester were a reflection of these inequalities. Grand townhouses and newly built factories stood side by side with slums, the disparity between wealth and poverty stark. The contrast was not only physical but social and economic. Those who benefited from the industrial boom had access to comfort, education, and security, while the working poor struggled daily for basic survival. This inequality shaped not just living conditions, but social attitudes, creating tension and sometimes outright hostility between classes. Philanthropy and reform existed, but they were often limited in scope and slow to enact real change. Alcohol played a significant role in this social landscape, acting as both a social lubricant and a coping mechanism. Alehouses and gin shops were scattered throughout the city, particularly in the poorer neighborhoods, offering cheap spirits to a population under constant pressure. For many, drinking was not merely a pastime but a necessary escape from the relentless grind of life in the slums. It provided temporary relief from hunger, exhaustion, and despair, though at a cost. Excessive drinking led to health problems, debt, and domestic strife, further complicating already fragile lives. Reformers and moralists decried this widespread culture of alcohol, seeing it as a social ill that perpetuated poverty and vice. Yet for the working-class communities, it was a bitter but often essential comfort. Education, too, was limited and unequal. While some initiatives sought to provide schooling for working children, many were forced to abandon learning to work in factories or contribute to household income. Literacy rates were low among the poor, limiting opportunities for advancement and reinforcing the cycle of deprivation. Those who could afford it sought to send their children to schools, hoping for a different life, but the reality for most was that childhood ended early, replaced by a lifetime of labor and struggle. Public health measures were in their infancy. Municipal authorities were often overwhelmed, unable to cope with the rapid influx of population and the conditions of urban poverty. Sanitation systems were inadequate, with streets clogged by waste and drainage systems failing to keep pace with the growing population. Epidemics were devastating and recurring, reminding residents that their survival was precarious and that death could arrive suddenly and indiscriminately. Yet even amidst this suffering, people found ways to celebrate, to create moments of joy, whether through local festivals, church gatherings, or simple social interactions. The physical environment of Manchester contributed to the difficulties of daily life. Smoke from countless factories blanketed the city, turning skies gray and polluting the air. Coal dust and soot coated buildings, streets, and clothes, a constant reminder of the industrial activity that both sustained and oppressed the population. Rivers and canals essential for transport and trade were often heavily polluted, their waters unsafe for drinking or washing. Nature seemed largely absent from the urban landscape, replaced by brick, iron, and coal, a reflection of the city's transformation into an industrial powerhouse at the expense of livability. Despite the grim realities, the city was alive with energy. Markets bustled with traders and buyers. Children ran through alleyways, and workers moved in a rhythm dictated by factory bells. Manchester was not merely a place of suffering, it was a place of human endeavor, of ingenuity, and of resilience. People adapted to their environment, finding ways to navigate challenges, build communities, and make life bearable where possible. Their stories are a testament to human endurance in the face of relentless adversity. Social reform movements began to take root during this period, sparked by the visibility of poverty and the inhuman conditions in which so many lived. Philanthropists, religious leaders, and early social scientists documented the slums, raising awareness and advocating for changes in housing, labor laws, and public health. Though change was slow and often met with resistance, these efforts laid the foundation for future improvements, highlighting the capacity for societal reflection and reform even amidst widespread suffering. The cultural life of Manchester, too, reflected its dual nature. Music halls, theaters, and public lectures offered entertainment and intellectual stimulation for those who could afford it. Religious institutions played a central role, providing spiritual guidance and, in some cases, practical assistance to the poor. Clubs and mutual aid societies emerged, allowing workers to pool resources, support each other during illness, and create networks that softened some of the harshness of life in the city. As we look back at Victorian Manchester, it becomes clear that the city was defined by contrasts: prosperity and poverty, opportunity and oppression, progress and suffering. The lives of those living in slums were shaped by forces beyond their control: economic systems, industrial demands, public health crises, and social hierarchies. Yet within this environment, ordinary people navigated daily life with resilience, resourcefulness, and, at times, remarkable courage. Understanding the conditions of Victorian Manchester is essential for appreciating the broader story of industrialization and urbanization in Britain. The city's slums were not merely backdrops to history, they were active spaces where the realities of industrial capitalism were lived, experienced, and contested. They revealed the human cost of economic progress, the inequalities that can arise in times of rapid change, and the enduring capacity of people to survive, adapt, and support one another even in the harshest circumstances. In this city of smoke, industry, and stark contrasts, the story of the working poor is a story of human endurance. It is a reminder that behind every era of progress, countless lives are shaped by forces both seen and unseen, and that history is as much about the experiences of ordinary people as it is about grand achievements and industrial triumphs. The streets of Manchester, lined with factories and slums, echo with the voices of those who lived, struggled, and persevered, offering lessons that remain relevant even today. The rise of the slums in Victorian Manchester was not an accident. It was the inevitable consequence of rapid industrial growth coupled with a lack of planning and foresight. As factories multiplied and employment opportunities drew thousands into the city, the infrastructure of Manchester could not keep pace. The influx of people from rural areas, villages, and smaller towns overwhelmed the housing stock, leaving families with no option but to crowd into whatever space they could find. Entire streets, once lined with modest houses or workshops, were transformed into cramped tenements where the living conditions were nothing short of appalling. These slums, which would come to define the urban experience for many of Manchester's working class, were characterized by overpopulation, squalor, and a complete absence of sanitation. In these neighborhoods, the typical dwelling consisted of a single room or a series of small rooms barely adequate to accommodate a family of 6, 8, or more. Floors were often bare and uneven, sometimes made of rotting timber, while walls were blackened with soot and smoke from the nearby factories and coal fires used for cooking and heating. Windows were small or broken, letting in little natural light and offering almost no protection from the biting winds that swept through the narrow streets. In some cases, multiple families shared a single building, with each family assigned 1 or 2 rooms, and common areas like kitchens, hallways, and toilets shared by dozens. Privacy was non-existent, and overcrowding was constant. Sanitation, or rather, the lack of it, was one of the defining features of these slums. There were few functioning drains or sewers, and human waste was often disposed of in the streets or in cesspits that overflowed into nearby alleys. Garbage accumulated quickly in front of the houses, creating a thick, foul-smelling layer that attracted rats and other vermin. Water supplies were unreliable and frequently contaminated. People drew water from wells that were dangerously close to open sewage, or they relied on shared pumps that often spread disease rather than providing relief. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were frequent, devastating communities in a matter of days. Infant mortality was extraordinarily high, and it was not uncommon for children to die before reaching the age of 5. Despite these appalling conditions, families did their best to survive. Mothers and older children performed endless domestic chores, often in the same cramped rooms where they lived and slept. Cooking, washing, and child care had to coexist in the same tiny spaces. Laundry was hung wherever possible, on ropes strung across the rooms or in the narrow courtyards, and the smell of damp, unwashed clothing mixed with smoke and the stench of waste. Meals were meager, consisting largely of bread, potatoes, and occasionally cheap meat or vegetables. For many, food was rationed strictly, and hunger was a constant presence. Parents often skipped meals to ensure that children could eat, and it was not unusual for children to go to school or work with empty stomachs, weak and susceptible to illness. Children's experiences in the slums were particularly harsh. Many were sent to work at a very young age, often in the factories, mills, or as street sellers. Some found employment as chimney sweeps or assistants in workshops, performing physically demanding and hazardous tasks. Childhood, as we understand it today, was often non-existent for those living in poverty. Play was limited to whatever brief moments could be stolen between chores, work, and survival. Education was often sacrificed for income, leaving children illiterate or only partially educated, perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Even when schools were available, attendance could be irregular due to illness, family responsibilities, or the need to earn money. Health conditions in these slums were dire. The combination of overcrowding, poor nutrition, contaminated water, and lack of sanitation created a breeding ground for disease. Outbreaks of cholera were particularly deadly, spreading rapidly through the densely packed streets. Typhoid and tuberculosis were endemic, and respiratory illnesses were common due to the pollution from factories and coal fires. Medical care was limited and often prohibitively expensive. Families relied on home remedies, the occasional visit from a local doctor, or charitable dispensaries, but the mortality rate remained high. Adults struggled with chronic illness, which made working even more difficult, while children frequently succumbed to preventable diseases. The physical structure of the slums themselves amplified these dangers. Narrow alleys and cramped backyards left little room for movement, ventilation, or sunlight. Damp and poorly constructed buildings contributed to the spread of respiratory illnesses. Fire was a constant threat. Open flames for cooking, heating, and lighting, combined with wooden floors and walls, meant that a single accident could devastate an entire block. Yet despite these conditions, people adapted. Furniture was improvised, rooms were rearranged to maximize space, and small acts of ingenuity, like using curtains or makeshift partitions, helped create a sense of privacy and order in otherwise chaotic surroundings. Economic hardship was inseparable from the slums. Most residents relied on low-paying, insecure work. Men labored long hours in factories, often 6 days a week, performing physically exhausting tasks. Women supplemented family income through domestic service, laundry, or home-based work such as sewing or spinning. Children worked wherever they could, and every member of the household contributed to survival. Wages were barely sufficient to meet basic needs, leaving little room for savings or emergencies. Families lived hand to mouth, and even a minor illness or accident could plunge them into destitution. The lack of social safety nets meant that neighbors often relied on each other for support, sharing food, childcare, and sometimes money to get through difficult times. Crime was an unfortunate byproduct of these conditions. Petty theft, burglary, and other minor crimes were common, not necessarily out of malice, but as desperate measures to survive. Law enforcement was limited, and policing was often reactive rather than preventive. Children and adolescents could be drawn into petty crime, and young offenders sometimes ended up in workhouses or reform schools. The workhouse system itself, intended to provide relief, was harsh and punitive. Conditions inside were intentionally difficult, designed to deter reliance on public assistance, and families often avoided them until absolutely necessary. Life in the slums was also shaped by the rhythms of work and leisure, though leisure was scarce and often modest. Markets bustled with activity, street vendors sold food and goods, and informal social gatherings provided some relief from daily toil. Taverns and alehouses were central to social life, offering a place to relax, converse, and temporarily escape the harsh realities of life. For many, drinking was a coping mechanism, dulling hunger and the relentless stress of survival. However, excessive alcohol consumption could exacerbate poverty, create domestic tensions, and worsen health, creating a cycle that was difficult to break. Despite these challenges, slum communities exhibited remarkable resilience and resourcefulness. People formed networks of mutual aid, supporting each other during illness, unemployment, or crisis. Neighbors shared skills, advice, and whatever material resources they could spare. Charitable organizations, religious groups, and early social reformers began to document the conditions of the slums, raising awareness and advocating for improvements. While change was slow, these efforts eventually contributed to the development of public health initiatives, housing reforms, and labor protections that would benefit future generations. The geography of the slums further influenced life. Many slum areas were located near factories, canals, or railway lines, which offered employment opportunities but also increased exposure to pollution, noise, and danger. Streets were narrow and often unpaved, turning into mud baths in rainy weather. Drainage was poor, and flooding was common, washing filth into homes and streets. Animals such as pigs and chickens were sometimes kept in backyards, contributing to sanitation problems but providing an essential source of food or income. Every aspect of the physical environment contributed to the harshness of daily life, requiring constant adaptation and resilience. The social hierarchy within the slums was complex. While poverty was widespread, there were gradations of wealth and status. Small shopkeepers, craftsmen, or skilled laborers occupied a slightly higher rung, able to afford marginally better living conditions. Yet even these individuals lived precariously, vulnerable to illness, economic downturns, or accidents. Social mobility was limited, and education and skill development were crucial for any chance of improving one's circumstances. Those who succeeded often did so through a combination of hard work, ingenuity, and sometimes sheer luck. Cultural life within the slums, while limited, was vibrant in its own ways. Religious institutions offered spiritual guidance, education, and some material assistance. Choirs, local gatherings, and festivals provided moments of joy, community cohesion, and shared identity. Even in the harshest environments, people found ways to celebrate life, whether through music, storytelling, or small personal achievements. These cultural elements were essential for maintaining morale and providing hope in an otherwise oppressive environment. The slums were also a stage for broader societal tensions. Industrialists and factory owners, motivated by profit, often ignored the welfare of workers, leading to disputes, strikes, and occasional riots. Social reformers, journalists, and writers exposed the conditions of slum life to the wider public, prompting debate and gradually legislative action. These interventions highlighted the contrast between the city's industrial success and the misery endured by its poorest residents, drawing attention to the human cost of rapid economic growth. Over time, awareness of the slums' conditions led to gradual reforms. Housing acts, sanitation improvements, and labor regulations slowly transformed the urban landscape, yet change was incremental, often resisted by those who profited from the status quo. The legacy of the slums endured, however, shaping urban planning, public health policy, and social consciousness in the decades that followed. Life in Manchester's slums was defined by adversity, but also by endurance, community, and the human spirit's capacity to adapt. The conditions were harsh, the challenges relentless, and the mortality rates tragically high, yet people found ways to survive, care for one another, and navigate the complex social and economic systems around them. These neighborhoods, though hidden from the eyes of the wealthy and powerful, were vibrant centers of life, struggle, and resilience. By examining the rise of the slums in Victorian Manchester, we gain insight into the human consequences of industrialization. The slums were more than just physical spaces. They were environments that shaped lives, relationships, and social structures. They reveal how ordinary people endured hardship, adapted to extraordinary challenges, and laid the groundwork for social reforms that would improve life for future generations. Understanding these realities allows us to appreciate both the cost of progress and the resilience of those who lived through one of the most transformative periods in urban history. Poverty in Victorian Manchester was not merely a lack of money, it was a defining feature of daily life, shaping every action, decision, and relationship. It was a relentless, all-encompassing condition that affected not only what people ate or wore, but also where they lived, how they worked, and even how they thought about the future. In the overcrowded slums of the city, poverty was visible in every street, alley, and doorway. Families lived in cramped, squalid conditions, with barely enough food to survive and no security to speak of. The very architecture of life seemed designed to keep people trapped in a cycle of hardship. Each day was a negotiation between necessity and endurance, between survival and dignity. Most families relied on wages earned through low-paid, insecure work, often at the mercy of industrial employers who had little concern for their well-being. Men labored in factories, mills, and workshops, performing repetitive, exhausting tasks for 12 or 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The noise of machinery was constant, drowning out the city's occasional moments of calm, and the physical toll was immense. Workers developed chronic fatigue, joint problems, and respiratory issues, yet their wages barely sufficed to feed themselves and their families. Even minor illness or injury could render them unable to work, plunging their households into immediate crisis. Women also played a crucial role in survival, often working alongside men in factories or taking on domestic service, laundry, sewing, and other home-based labor. Their work was undervalued, underpaid, and exhausting, yet it was essential for the household's survival. Many women balanced multiple jobs, rising before dawn to prepare meals, tend to children, and complete domestic chores, then heading out into the city for long hours of labor. Some women also engaged in informal or precarious economic activity, such as selling baked goods or mending clothes for neighbors, adding every possible contribution to the family's meager income. Children were another vital component of the household economy. From an early age, they were expected to contribute to the family's survival. Working in factories, mills, or workshops, or performing street labor such as selling newspapers, running errands, or scavenging materials to sell. Their childhoods were brief and harsh, with little time for play or formal education. Even those who attended school often faced irregular attendance. Forced to miss lessons to work or help at home, the burden on children was enormous and the risks were high. Accidents in factories or workshops were common, sometimes fatal, and diseases spread rapidly among poorly nourished and overworked youngsters. Food scarcity was a constant and pressing concern. Most families subsisted on the cheapest possible diet, often consisting of bread, potatoes, and occasionally small portions of meat or vegetables. Meals were repetitive and nutritionally inadequate, leading to widespread malnutrition and stunted growth among children. Hunger was a daily presence, influencing behavior, mood, and energy levels. In extreme cases, families resorted to creative measures to make ends meet, stretching meals, scavenging scraps, or borrowing from neighbors and family members. The fear of an empty stomach was ever present, and parents often prioritized feeding children over themselves, going hungry to ensure that the younger generation survived. Clothing and personal care were similarly constrained by poverty. Garments were often handmade, patched repeatedly, and passed down through families. Children frequently wore worn-out shoes or went barefoot, and adults wore clothing that was threadbare and ill-fitting. Cleanliness was difficult to maintain, not only because of the lack of resources but also due to the unsanitary conditions of the slums. People lived with filth and waste as constant companions, and the effort required to maintain hygiene was immense. Baths and clean water were luxuries, and laundry was labor-intensive, consuming significant portions of the day. Despite these challenges, people made remarkable efforts to maintain dignity and present themselves as best they could, reflecting a quiet resilience that persisted even in extreme hardship. Housing insecurity compounded the struggles of poverty. Many families rented rooms or apartments on a week-to-week basis, vulnerable to eviction if they could not meet their payments. Slum landlords often charged exorbitant rents for substandard accommodations, and disputes over payment could lead to abrupt displacement. Families who lost their homes faced the terrifying prospect of the workhouse, an institution intended to provide relief but deliberately harsh to deter dependency. Conditions in the workhouse were grueling. Strict rules, long hours of labor, and insufficient food made them places of last resort, avoided whenever possible. Consequently, many endured hardship at home rather than seek institutional assistance, demonstrating the tough choices poverty forced upon them. Health was inextricably linked to poverty, with illness both a cause and consequence of hardship. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making individuals more susceptible to disease. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and influenza swept through crowded streets, often killing the young and elderly first. Chronic illnesses such as tuberculosis were endemic. Exacerbated by damp, poorly ventilated housing, medical care was limited, expensive, and often inaccessible to the poorest families. Doctors charged fees beyond the reach of working-class households, and remedies were largely home-based or provided by charitable dispensaries that could offer only minimal treatment. Death was a constant companion, and families lived with the grief of losing multiple children or relatives, a reality that shaped the very rhythm of daily life. Employment instability further exacerbated poverty. Many workers were employed seasonally or on temporary contracts, leaving households vulnerable during periods of unemployment. Economic fluctuations, strikes, or downturns in industrial production could mean weeks or months without income. Families relied on networks of neighbors, friends, and extended family for support, sharing food, money, or labor to survive periods of scarcity. This reliance on community reflected a collective resilience, but it also underscored the precariousness of life in Victorian Manchester, where individual survival was constantly intertwined with the fortunes of others. Debt was another common challenge. Even the smallest household expenses could lead to borrowing, whether from local shopkeepers, pawnbrokers, or informal lenders. Interest rates were often high, and failure to repay could result in legal action or the loss of possessions. Debt constrained decision-making, limited opportunities for upward mobility, and created cycles of dependence that were difficult to escape. Families were forced to carefully balance immediate needs against potential future consequences, a delicate calculation that dictated virtually every aspect of life. Social stigma and moral judgment were closely tied to poverty. Working poor were often blamed for their circumstances, depicted by middle and upper-class observers as lazy, immoral, or irresponsible. This perception ignored the structural factors, low wages, inadequate housing, and lack of social support, that shaped life in the slums. Families internalized some of this judgment, experiencing shame and anxiety about their inability to provide for their children or meet societal expectations. Yet within these communities, solidarity and mutual respect persisted. creating a sense of dignity despite external condemnation. Education was both a potential escape from poverty and a luxury many could not afford. While some children attended schools or Sunday classes, attendance was often irregular and teaching quality varied. Many working-class families prioritized immediate survival over formal education, sending children to work instead. Illiteracy remained widespread, limiting employment opportunities and reinforcing social stratification. For those who managed to receive an education, the rewards could be significant, offering a chance to secure better, paying work or skilled employment. However, such opportunities were rare, and the majority remained bound to low-wage, physically demanding labor. The environment of poverty also shaped behavior and social norms. Survival required resourcefulness, adaptability, and sometimes moral compromise. Families engaged in informal economies, such as selling scraps, performing odd jobs, or mending clothes to supplement meager incomes. Children were taught practical skills from an early age, from basic labor to negotiation and problem solving. Resource management became a central skill, as households stretched every penny and every morsel of food to its limits. Decisions about who ate, who worked, and how to prioritize scarce resources were constant, shaping daily life with a sense of urgency and necessity. The physical and emotional toll of poverty cannot be overstated. Chronic stress, exhaustion, and worry permeated households. Adults carried the burden of providing for their families in environments that were hostile and unforgiving, while children grew up in conditions that left lasting marks on their health, development, and psyche. Mental health struggles, though largely unrecognized and untreated, were common, with anxiety, depression, and despair woven into the fabric of daily life. Yet, amidst these hardships, moments of resilience and joy emerged. Celebrations, religious gatherings, and small personal achievements offered brief respite and reinforced a sense of humanity and hope. Employment in factories, mills, and workshops was central to survival. Yet it was fraught with danger. Machinery was hazardous, safety regulations were minimal, and injuries were frequent. Workers faced the dual challenge of performing demanding labor while navigating unsafe conditions. Accidents could leave individuals permanently disabled, eliminating their ability to earn a livelihood and plunging families deeper into poverty. These realities instilled a practical toughness and an acceptance of risk that was part of daily existence. Poverty was also gendered, affecting men and women differently. Men were judged primarily on their ability to provide financially, while women bore the responsibility for domestic management, child rearing, and supplementary labor. Both faced constraints, but women's labor was often undervalued or unrecognized, despite being essential to the household's survival. Single women, widows, and those without male support were particularly vulnerable, reliant on casual work, charity, or extended family networks to sustain themselves and their children. Despite the overwhelming challenges, poverty did not erase culture, community, or identity. People in Victorian Manchester's slums developed rich social networks, traditions, and shared practices that sustained them. Festivals, religious observances, music, storytelling, and informal gatherings provided relief from monotony and hardship. These cultural practices created cohesion, reinforced social norms, and offered a sense of belonging, reminding individuals that they were part of a larger community even in the harshest conditions. The impact of poverty extended beyond the individual household to the city as a whole. Slum neighborhoods shaped labor markets, public health crises, and social policy. Reformers and social observers documented the conditions, exposing the human cost of industrialization and advocating for housing reforms, labor protections, and sanitation improvements. These efforts laid the groundwork for legislative changes that would, over time, mitigate some of the harshest effects of urban poverty. In Victorian Manchester, Poverty was not just an economic condition, but a way of life. It influenced every choice, shaped every relationship, and defined the daily experience of millions. Survival required ingenuity, endurance, and mutual support, and even small successes were significant victories against overwhelming odds. Families, children, and communities navigated the relentless pressures of scarcity with resilience, creativity, and determination, revealing the strength of the human spirit even in environments of profound deprivation. Understanding poverty in this context allows us to appreciate the complex interplay of economic, social, and environmental factors that shaped life in Victorian Manchester. It reveals the hidden stories of resilience, resourcefulness, and community solidarity that are often overshadowed by the grand narratives of industrial achievement. The daily struggles for food, shelter, work, and safety were not merely obstacles. They were defining features of life, shaping identity, behavior, and social organization. The story of poverty in Victorian Manchester is a story of endurance, adaptation, and survival. It is a reminder that economic progress often comes at a human cost, and that behind the smokestacks and industrial triumphs were millions of people living lives defined by struggle, resilience, and determination. The lessons of this period resonate even today, highlighting the importance of social support, fair labor practices, and the need to address structural inequalities in society. Life in poverty was harsh, unrelenting, and often tragic, yet it was also filled with small triumphs, enduring bonds, and moments of hope. Families found ways to stretch meager resources, children contributed to survival while maintaining a sense of play and imagination, and communities formed networks of support that softened the worst effects of hardship. These stories, though often hidden, reveal the richness and complexity of life under conditions of scarcity and the enduring capacity of humans to endure, adapt, and persevere. In the shadowed alleys and narrow streets of Victorian Manchester, alcohol was far more than a beverage. It was a lifeline, a social institution, and for many, a temporary refuge from the relentless hardships of life in the slums. The city's industrial rise, with its booming factories and crowded tenements, created an environment in which stress, exhaustion, and poverty were constants. Within this environment, drinking became a common response, a way for men and women to cope with hunger, fatigue, and despair, and a social mechanism through which communities could bond, even in the midst of suffering. Alehouses, taverns, gin shops, and informal drinking dens dotted the urban landscape, especially in poorer districts, offering cheap spirits to those with little money and fewer options. These establishments were ubiquitous, their presence a reflection of both the need for escape and the city's tolerance, or perhaps indifference, to widespread alcohol consumption. For many, the first encounter with alcohol came early in life. Children in working-class families were exposed to drinking in domestic settings, often tasting watered-down beer or ale, while observing adults consuming spirits as part of daily routine. As they grew older, they learned to navigate the social norms of consumption, recognizing drinking not only as a personal indulgence, but as a shared cultural practice. For men, drinking after long hours in the factory was a form of relaxation, a moment to unwind and release the tension accumulated through grueling labor. For women, it sometimes offered a brief respite from domestic chores, childcare, and the grinding pressures of poverty. Though societal norms generally constrained women's public consumption more strictly than men's, the prevalence of alcohol was closely tied to economic and social conditions. Cheap spirits, especially gin, were widely available and affordable even for families living hand-to-mouth. The quality was often poor, with low-grade alcohol sometimes adulterated with harmful additives, creating risks of illness and poisoning. Yet, the allure of immediate relief from hunger, cold, and mental strain outweighed the potential dangers. Drinking became a coping strategy, a temporary escape from the monotony and misery of slum life. It provided warmth, numbed physical and emotional pain, and in the crowded and oppressive conditions of tenements, offered a rare sense of autonomy and control. Alehouses and gin shops served as social hubs, places where people could gather, converse, and exchange news. For men, they were spaces to discuss work, politics, or local events, often engaging in gambling or card games to pass the time. For women, informal gatherings sometimes occurred within domestic spaces or community halls, creating opportunities to share advice, support, and companionship. Alcohol, therefore, was not merely about intoxication. It was deeply embedded in social structures, influencing relationships, interactions, and the rhythms of daily life. In many cases, it strengthened communal bonds, offering shared rituals that provided a sense of identity and belonging amid poverty and instability. However, the culture of drink had consequences that could be devastating. Excessive alcohol consumption exacerbated poverty by diverting scarce resources from essential needs such as food, rent, and clothing. Families often struggled to balance limited incomes against the demands of survival and the lure of temporary relief offered by alcohol. Over time, chronic drinking could impair physical health, weaken the body, and reduce the capacity to work, creating a vicious cycle that deepened hardship. In slum neighborhoods, alcoholism became a persistent social problem, contributing to domestic violence, neglect of children, and social disorder. The impact on families was profound. Husbands and fathers who drank heavily often returned home exhausted, irritable, or aggressive, creating tension and conflict within households. Women bore the brunt of domestic management, caring for children, maintaining the home, and mitigating the consequences of drunkenness. Children were affected both directly and indirectly, witnessing violence, experiencing neglect, and sometimes mimicking adult behaviors. The psychological toll was significant, with anxiety, stress, and trauma woven into the daily experience of households in which drinking was a constant feature. Yet, for all its dangers, alcohol remained an indispensable element of coping. It offered moments of relief and pleasure in lives otherwise dominated by hardship. Public houses and gin shops became spaces where stories were shared, friendships formed, and fleeting laughter could be found. Music, singing, and storytelling often accompanied drinking, providing cultural enrichment even in impoverished areas. In these moments, alcohol served not only as a chemical escape, but also as a social lubricant, enabling human connection and cultural expression under conditions of extreme deprivation. Prevalence of alcohol also intersected with broader social and moral debates of the era. Reformers, clergy, and social critics decried the consumption of gin and ale among the poor, linking drinking to immorality, laziness, and social decay. Pamphlets, sermons, and newspapers frequently highlighted the dangers of alcoholism, depicting it as a root cause of crime, poverty, and family breakdown. Legislative efforts, such as the Gin Act and licensing regulations, attempted to control consumption, often with limited success. Enforcement was inconsistent, and illicit distillation and unregulated sales flourished, demonstrating the difficulty of legislating behavior deeply embedded in culture and necessity. Alcohol also played a role in the urban economy. Taverns and gin shops provided employment for landlords, bartenders, and suppliers, and the sale of spirits generated tax revenue for the government. This economic dimension complicated efforts at reform, as authorities were often reluctant to fully restrict an activity that contributed to both local economies and national coffers. The interplay of economics, culture, and necessity created a complex landscape in which drinking was both a social ill and a survival strategy, difficult to eradicate without addressing the underlying conditions that fueled it. For the working poor, the consequences of alcohol were intertwined with the physical and psychological demands of industrial labor. Long hours in noisy, dangerous factories left men exhausted and anxious, with little energy for domestic responsibilities or personal care. Alcohol offered a momentary reprieve, a way to unwind and temporarily escape the pressures of work. In this sense, drinking can be seen as a form of self-medication, a coping mechanism that addresses both physical fatigue and emotional stress. However, the very relief it provided often carried long-term costs, reducing productivity, straining relationships, and compounding health problems. Women's relationship to alcohol was complex and multifaceted. While social norms generally discouraged public drinking among women, many consumed spirits in domestic contexts, often to cope with stress, exhaustion, and grief. For widows or single mothers, alcohol sometimes represented a rare opportunity for relaxation and psychological relief. In informal social gatherings, women shared drinks as part of communal bonding, reinforcing social networks that provided crucial support. Despite societal disapproval, drinking functioned as a practical, if risky, tool for managing the burdens of poverty. Children were exposed to alcohol both directly and indirectly. In some households, watered down beer or ale was consumed as part of meals, while older children occasionally assisted in taverns or shops, learning about alcohol consumption and trade. The normalization of drinking from an early age contributed to a culture in which alcohol was a pervasive presence, influencing attitudes and behaviors across generations. Children witnessed the benefits and dangers, absorbing lessons about social norms, coping strategies, and the consequences of overindulgence. Alcohol's impact on public health was significant. Chronic consumption contributed to liver disease, malnutrition, and other health problems. Combined with the unsanitary conditions of slums, poor diets, and hard labor, drinking increased susceptibility to illness and reduced life expectancy. Epidemics of disease often intersected with alcohol consumption, as impaired health and weakened immune systems made communities more vulnerable. Medical practitioners of the era observed these patterns, linking excessive drinking to both immediate and long-term health crises among the urban poor. At the same time, drinking had a cultural dimension that cannot be ignored. Songs, rhymes, and stories about taverns, alehouses, and local spirits formed part of the oral tradition of working-class communities. Drinking events often coincided with holidays, religious festivals, or local celebrations, providing opportunities for collective joy and identity formation. Even amidst hardship, alcohol served as a medium through which cultural expression and communal life could be maintained, illustrating the dual nature of drinking as both a social problem and a form of resilience. Efforts to reform drinking habits were met with mixed success. Temperance societies emerged in Manchester and other industrial cities, advocating moderation or total abstinence. Religious leaders often promoted sobriety, linking moral virtue to control over consumption. Pamphlets and educational programs attempted to inform the public about the dangers of excessive drinking, yet these efforts frequently clashed with the realities of daily life. When people faced hunger, exhaustion, and the monotony of factory labor, the appeal of cheap alcohol was overwhelming. Moral exhortation alone could not replace the psychological and physical relief that drinking provided. The cityscape itself reflected the centrality of alcohol. Taverns and gin shops were visible in every district, with signs advertising cheap drinks and welcoming patrons at all hours. Streets echoed with the noise of social gatherings, laughter, and quarrels, creating a distinctive urban soundscape. The physical presence of drinking establishments reinforced the social acceptance of alcohol and its integration into daily routines. The density of these establishments in slum neighborhoods underscored the relationship between poverty, labor, and consumption, illustrating how environment and social conditions shaped behavior. Economic pressures often dictated the quantity and quality of alcohol consumed. The working poor could not afford luxury spirits and often relied on low-cost, high-alcohol beverages, sometimes adulterated or of dubious quality. Gin, in particular, was cheap and potent, providing rapid intoxication but carrying serious health risks. Beer and ale, while less concentrated, were consumed in large quantities, sometimes as a substitute for water, which was unsafe or contaminated. These practices illustrate the intersection of necessity and culture, where drinking fulfilled multiple needs: nourishment, social engagement, and psychological relief. Despite the dangers, alcohol consumption also reflected agency and choice. In an environment where autonomy was limited, selecting when, where, and with whom to drink provided a measure of control. For men and women working under oppressive economic and social conditions, these choices, however small, were significant. They allowed individuals to assert identity, form relationships, and exercise judgment in an otherwise constrained life. Drinking, in this sense, was not merely escapism, but a form of human adaptation to adversity. The interplay between alcohol, labor, and poverty created complex social dynamics. Employers often tolerated drinking as part of worker culture, recognizing its role in morale, but fearing its impact on productivity. Workers navigated the tension between the relief provided by alcohol and the expectations of labor discipline, balancing personal needs with economic survival. In households, alcohol consumption influenced family dynamics, negotiation, and hierarchy, with men often controlling finances related to purchasing spirits and women managing the consequences. Alcohol's cultural, economic, and social dimensions highlight its dual role in Victorian Manchester. It was a source of pleasure, social cohesion, and coping, yet also a catalyst for health problems, domestic conflict, and economic strain. Understanding this duality is essential for comprehending life in the city's slums, where survival required navigating an environment in which every choice carried consequences, and relief often came at a cost. The culture of drink in Manchester's slums was thus both a symptom and a solution. It reflected the pressures of industrial life, the limitations of poverty, and the social structures that constrained behavior. At the same time, it offered a form of temporary relief, emotional release, and social connection. The very prevalence of drinking underscores the human capacity to adapt, to find solace, and to create moments of joy even under conditions of extreme deprivation. Drinking also intersected with other aspects of life, including crime, morality, and public perception. Drunkenness could lead to street altercations, theft, or other minor offenses, often criminalized and punished in ways that disproportionately affected the working poor. Moralists framed alcohol consumption as a moral failing, attributing social ills to individual weakness rather than structural inequality. Yet for those living in slums, drinking was often a rational response to conditions of deprivation, stress, and labor, illustrating the complex relationship between necessity and morality in Victorian society. Ultimately, alcohol was an inseparable part of life in Victorian Manchester's slums. It shaped communities, influenced family dynamics, affected health, and defined cultural practices. It was both a coping mechanism and a hazard, a source of temporary relief and long-term consequence. Understanding its role allows us to appreciate the multifaceted strategies that people employed to endure poverty, exhaustion, and social marginalization. It reminds us that human behavior is often shaped as much by context and necessity as by choice or morality. The culture of drink also left a lasting legacy, influencing public health initiatives, social reform movements, and urban policy. Efforts to control consumption, improve housing, and regulate employment were informed by the recognition that alcohol was intertwined with broader social conditions. Reformers sought not only to limit drinking, but to address the underlying causes, poverty, overcrowding, and lack of opportunity. These interventions highlight the interplay between individual behavior and structural factors, demonstrating that social problems cannot be understood in isolation from their environment. In conclusion, the culture of drink in Victorian Manchester's slums was a complex and deeply embedded phenomenon. It was shaped by poverty, labor, social networks, and cultural practices, serving as a vital coping mechanism for those enduring the harsh realities of industrial life. At the same time, it created risks and reinforced cycles of hardship, illustrating the dual nature of alcohol as both relief and hazard. To understand the lives of the working poor, it is essential to recognize the central role of drinking in their daily existence and the ways in which it reflected human resilience, adaptation, and the search for solace amidst relentless adversity. Life in Victorian Manchester was defined not only by the visible hardships of slums, poverty, and drink, but also by the invisible toll these conditions exacted on the human spirit. The physical environment, with its overcrowded and squalid housing, combined with the grueling demands of industrial labor, created a landscape of constant strain. The human cost was profound, touching every aspect of life, from health and mortality to psychological well-being and social cohesion. The narrative of Manchester's poor is one of endurance under relentless pressure, a testament to human resilience even in the face of extreme adversity. Families were the central unit through which the effects of poverty were both experienced and mitigated. In households of 6, 8, or more people, every member contributed to survival. Adults labored long hours in factories, mills, or workshops, while children as young as 6 or 7 performed dangerous and exhausting work. Women managed domestic tasks, childcare, and often supplemental labor to sustain the household. Each day was a balancing act, allocating time, energy, and scarce resources to meet immediate needs while attempting to plan for the uncertain future. The human cost was evident in the weariness etched on faces, the chronic illnesses that plagued bodies, and the emotional strain carried silently by parents struggling to protect their children. The mortality rate in Manchester's slums was staggering. Infant mortality was extraordinarily high, with many children succumbing to preventable diseases such as cholera, typhoid, or dysentery. Those who survived infancy often faced ongoing health challenges, weakened by malnutrition, overwork, and exposure to disease. Adults, too, were vulnerable, with respiratory illnesses, injuries, and chronic conditions eroding life expectancy. The toll was not only physical but emotional. Families experienced repeated grief and loss, which shaped relationships and social behavior. Death was an omnipresent reality, and communities developed coping mechanisms to manage its ubiquity, drawing on shared experience, faith, and mutual support. Despite these conditions, resilience flourished. Human ingenuity and resourcefulness were central to survival. Families improvised solutions to maximize limited space, reusing and repairing clothing, furniture, and household items. Communities created informal support networks, sharing food, childcare, and labor. Neighbors relied on one another in times of illness or crisis, pooling resources and providing practical aid. These networks were vital for both survival and social cohesion, illustrating the capacity of human beings to adapt to harsh environments through cooperation and mutual aid. Children, despite the burdens imposed on them, displayed remarkable adaptability. Many developed skills and responsibilities far beyond their years. Learning to navigate dangerous industrial environments, contribute to household income, and care for younger siblings. Play, when it occurred, was often creative and improvised, reflecting a resilient spirit that found joy even amidst deprivation. Storytelling, games, and local traditions provided a mental and emotional outlet, preserving a sense of childhood and imagination against the oppressive backdrop of slum life. Health crises were among the most visible and devastating human costs of poverty. Epidemics swept through the city with terrifying speed, often claiming large numbers of young and vulnerable. Cholera outbreaks, in particular, highlighted the link between poor sanitation and disease. Water contaminated with human waste and the close proximity of dwellings created ideal conditions for rapid transmission. Public health measures were in their infancy, and municipal authorities were often overwhelmed, unable to respond effectively to recurrent crises. Families relied on home remedies, advice from neighbors, and limited charitable assistance to cope. But the effectiveness of these measures was variable at best. The human toll was immense, shaping the experience of daily life with fear, anxiety, and vigilance. Mental health was also profoundly affected. The stress of chronic poverty, coupled with overwork, overcrowding, and high mortality rates, led to widespread anxiety, depression, and despair. Psychological strain was compounded by social stigma. Poor were often blamed for their circumstances, labeled as lazy or morally deficient, reinforcing feelings of shame and inadequacy. Yet even in this context, resilience emerged. Religious faith, communal gatherings, and cultural traditions provided outlets for coping, offering hope and a sense of purpose. People adapted psychologically as well as physically, developing mechanisms to endure a relentless environment. The labor system itself exacted a human toll. Factories and mills demanded long hours under harsh conditions, with little regard for worker safety. Machinery was dangerous, ventilation poor, and exposure to dust, smoke, and chemicals constant. Injuries were common, and medical care was minimal. Work was not merely tiring, it was physically debilitating, with repetitive strain, accidents, and chronic fatigue eroding health over time. Yet labor was essential for survival, creating a cycle in which the pursuit of income exacerbated vulnerability to illness and injury. Alcohol consumption, as previously discussed, played a dual role in this environment. It offered temporary relief from exhaustion, stress, and hunger, but also contributed to health problems. Domestic conflict and economic strain. The human cost of alcohol was intertwined with the broader challenges of poverty and labor, illustrating the complex interplay between coping mechanisms and the harsh realities of life. It was both a symptom of social pressure and a tool for endurance, highlighting the nuanced ways in which individuals navigated adversity. Despite the overwhelming challenges, social reform began to emerge as a response to human suffering. Reformers, philanthropists, and early social scientists began to document the conditions of slums, raising awareness of human cost of industrialization. Reports detailed overcrowding, inadequate housing, poor sanitation, and the toll on physical and mental health. These accounts, often graphic and deeply moving, sought to draw public attention to the plight of the working poor and to pressure authorities into action. They emphasized that the hardships of slum life were not merely personal failings, but structural consequences of industrial growth and urban neglect. Charitable organizations played a vital role in mitigating suffering. Religious institutions, in particular, provided education, food, and medical care to the poorest families. Sunday schools offered literacy and moral instruction, while charitable societies distributed clothing, coal, and other necessities during harsh winters. These interventions were not universally effective, but they represented important attempts to alleviate immediate human suffering and to provide a measure of dignity and stability in a harsh environment. Volunteers and social workers often risked their own health and comfort to engage with the most deprived areas, demonstrating the capacity for compassion and organized social support in the midst of systemic neglect. Housing reform emerged as a critical avenue for addressing the human cost of poverty. Advocates documented the dangers of overcrowded, poorly constructed slums and proposed alternatives, including model dwellings with improved sanitation, ventilation, and access to light and water. The initiatives, while limited in scope, represented early recognition that human health and well-being were intimately connected to the physical environment. They also highlighted the importance of structural change rather than solely individual responsibility, emphasizing that alleviating human suffering required collective action and policy intervention. Labor reform, too, began to take shape in response to the human cost of industrial work. Campaigns to reduce working hours, improve safety, and restrict child labor were driven by both moral and practical concerns. Activists argued that the exploitation of workers not only harmed individuals, but undermined the long-term sustainability of the industrial economy. These early efforts laid the groundwork for more comprehensive labor protections in the 20th century, illustrating the intersection of social advocacy, human welfare, and economic policy. Education was increasingly recognized as a crucial tool for breaking the cycle of poverty. Initiatives aimed at improving access to schooling, literacy, and vocational training sought to equip children with the skills necessary to escape the harsh realities of slum life. While attendance remained irregular due to economic necessity, these programs offered hope for social mobility and improved quality of life. Education also functioned as a moral and cultural intervention, shaping values, habits, and aspirations that could influence the trajectory of families and communities. Community resilience was evident in the networks formed among residents of slums. Neighbors shared food, labor, and advice, creating informal safety nets that mitigated the worst effects of poverty. Mutual aid societies and friendly societies offered financial support during illness, unemployment, or death, providing both practical assistance and emotional reassurance. These communal structures reinforced social cohesion, offering a sense of solidarity in an environment that could otherwise be isolating and threatening. Religion played a multifaceted role in mediating human suffering. Churches and chapels offered spiritual guidance, moral instruction, and practical support, including charity, schooling, and medical assistance. Faith provided a framework for understanding hardship, offering hope and resilience in the face of adversity. Religious communities often served as centers of social life, where people could gather, share experiences, and reinforce communal bonds. The moral and practical support provided by these institutions was a critical factor in sustaining life in the slums, demonstrating the interplay between belief, culture, and survival. The psychological resilience of individuals was remarkable. Despite constant exposure to hardship, illness, and loss, many people maintained hope, humor, and a capacity for joy. Celebrations, storytelling, music, and local festivals offered respite from daily struggles, creating moments of connection and pleasure. Even brief periods of rest or laughter had significant value, bolstering morale and reinforcing the social fabric of communities. These experiences highlight the human capacity to endure, adapt, and find meaning even in the most challenging circumstances. The recognition of the human cost of industrialization and urban poverty gradually led to broader public awareness. Writers, journalists, and social commentators documented the conditions of slums, bringing the experiences of the working poor to the attention of policymakers and the middle class. Public exhibitions, statistical reports, and narrative accounts emphasized the structural causes of suffering, challenging prevailing assumptions that poverty was primarily a moral failing. These efforts contributed to the emergence of social reform movements, laying the foundation for legislation addressing housing, labor, sanitation, and public health. The interplay between individual resilience and structural reform is central to understanding life in Victorian Manchester. While families and communities developed strategies to survive and thrive under adverse conditions, systemic change was necessary to address the root causes of human suffering. The early reforms in housing, labor, sanitation, and education illustrate the gradual recognition that alleviating poverty required coordinated, collective action informed by evidence and human experience. Ultimately, the human cost of life in Victorian Manchester was immense, yet it coexisted with resilience, ingenuity, and the emergence of social conscience. Families endured extraordinary physical and emotional strain, children navigated dangerous and laborious environments, and communities organized to support one another amidst scarcity. At the same time, reformers, philanthropists, and social observers began to challenge conditions, advocating for structural change and laying the groundwork for future improvements. The story of Victorian Manchester does not end with the hardship, slums, poverty, and drink. It extends into the enduring legacy of human resilience.